Hello everyone, I'm Pooja Kant Alfred from emofreetherapy.com. And today I'd like to talk about biases and how they impact us as EFT practitioners. I think it's a very interesting topic, and I'm going to be talking about what kinds of biases are there and how we are all born with biases, and what are the neurological underpinnings of biases, and how we can deal with these biases. So here's the thing, we all would like to think that we are unbiased, that we don't make internal judgments, or we don't have opinions or beliefs that influence us in the sessions, in the EFT sessions. So obviously we think that we are unbiased. But the fact is that we are all biased. And this is what I'm going to explain in this presentation, that we are all biased and we don't have to feel bad about it, because when you're aware of your biases, then you can do something about those biases. So we see ourselves as non-judgmental and as not having any biases. And especially those of us who are psychotherapists, we are told to be objective at all costs. However, it is impossible to be unbiased. But what is possible is to be aware of any biases that are hidden. Now, Laura S. Brown, who's a clinical and forensic psychotherapist, she says that by the time that our first client enters the office, the average psychotherapist will have had multiple experiences of classically conditioned associations with the visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and other sensory cues presented by that individual. The psychotherapist will have bias simply by virtue of being human. So this tells us that we are bound to have biases because we will have all these sensory inputs that will be coming from the client. So let's go to the next part of this presentation, which is what are biases. Bias can be defined as a broad term that refers to a group of stereotypical beliefs and attitudes about social groups. And what are prejudices? Prejudice is basically an attitude and a feeling that can be positive or negative, which is formed solely on the assumptions based on an individual's membership to a particular group or groups. For example, ageism, it's a prejudice, it's a stereotype, and where people have these negative attitudes towards older adults. Now, the next one is stereotypes. I just want to give all these definitions first, and then we will go to the different kinds of biases and talk more about the explicit and the implicit bias. So stereotypes are basically beliefs formed on the basis of oversimplified perception involving a group of people. So for example, I was reading about this study in the Psychology Monitor. In one study, when students misbehaved a second time, then teachers were more likely to stereotype the black students as troublemakers and recommend harsher discipline. And this is a kind of stereotype. Now, what are the different kinds of biases? There are two basic biases. One is explicit and the other one is implicit. Now, explicit biases are overt and people are aware of them. For example, being biased against people with darker skin tones, as it is prevalent in India. These explicit biases result in harassment, exclusion, violence, and other overt displays of power. And usually people in dominant groups show this towards minority groups, or let's say the target group members. Now, the next one is the implicit bias. Now, implicit biases are more unconscious and they're difficult to study, but with the help of a lot of imaging studies and other kinds of ways of studying the implicit biases, the researchers have come to know that the people who have implicit bias, they are not aware of it. So they won't even know that it influences their behavior because it is unconscious. It is automatic, and the person will have feelings and thoughts about the target group or individual. Now, these biases, they operate outside of a person's awareness and they get activated unconsciously when these people who have these biases interact with people of a certain group. So for example, a teacher might favor a student only because the student belongs to a certain group and the teacher might not be even aware of it. There's another form of implicit bias which is called aversive bias or aversive racism. Now, what are aversive biases? I'm quoting Laura Brown, and she says that aversive bias refers to non-conscious biases that are held by individuals who consciously avoid using overt expressions of bias. So, what happens is that there's a split that emerges in individuals between their expressed conscious beliefs and their non conscious biases. So, there's an inherent contradiction that exists when you deny your personal prejudice or explicit bias, and it coexists with an underlying unconscious implicit bias. So you have these negative feelings and beliefs that are unconscious, and they exist with a prejudice which is explicit bias but which you're denying. So the negative feelings that aversive racists experience are typically more diffuse, such as feelings of anxiety and uneasiness, as reported by Dovidio and Gartner in their study. And there are dissociations between implicit and explicit attitudes, and these are commonly observed in attitudes towards stigmatized groups, including groups defined by race, age, ethnicity, disability, and sexual orientation. Now, the thing about aversive biases is that they are there because of denial and disowning. And because you deny and disown these biases, it leads to shame, discomfort, and distancing by people who belong to dominant groups from the minority groups. So, members of minority groups are often attuned to cues of bias coming from the members of dominant groups. So, for example, if a practitioner is from a dominant group and the client is from minority group, and even though the practitioner claims to not have any bias, the practitioner might be giving off angry vibes of or energy that the client can easily pick on. And I will be speaking more about this in terms of the neuropsychology behind it later in this presentation. We are coded to notice difference. Evolutionary biology and psychology indicates that human beings are coded to notice difference. What happens is that when there is another human that differs from us in some way, then our limbic system lights up and becomes active, and it tells us that there is this difference between that person and us. So, if you say that as an EFT practitioner you will be totally unbiased, then it would be presuming that you don't have a limbic system input and no personal history. That's not possible. So, because we all make sensory impressions of our clients, and we have these beliefs and non-conscious biases that we have acquired early in life. And unless we become aware of them, we will be actually hindering the progress in the sessions. So, it's very important to be aware of these biases. Now, what is implicit stereotyping? Let's take a look at our brain. So, the outer layer of the brain is called the cortex, and it is divided into 4 lobes. And one of these lobes, which is called the frontal lobe, is responsible for the executive functions like planning, goal setting, morality, and cognitive control. And on the underside of the prefrontal cortex, you have this area which is called the orbitofrontal cortex, which is responsible for self-regulation, how to regulate your emotions, your moods, self-soothing. Now, the association areas are also there, and they are part of the cortex and the prefrontal cortex, and they get inputs from many areas to form perception and thought. Now, where does the mirror neuron system come in? Now, the mirror neuron system is really important when we talk about implicit stereotyping. It is a part of the association areas. So, let me give you an example. You watch someone forget his lines on the stage and you feel that embarrassment. You watch a kid fall while skating and you feel sympathy. You watch someone jump from a high building and your stomach, does flip-flop. So, these are your mirror neurons at work. What are mirror neurons? So mirror neurons, basically they're a type of brain cell that respond equally when we perform an action and when we witness someone else perform the same action. And how does it come in when we talk about implicit stereotypes? So the thing is that implicit stereotypes that we form are based on the association areas, and they are supported by the subcortical structures like the amygdala. Quoting Amodio and Devine, they said that implicit evaluative bias is typically expressed in non-verbal behaviors and affective responses, such as having more uncomfortable interactions, less eye contact, and more blinking. Now, here's the thing that's interesting. The mirror neurons in the target person, basically the person that you have the bias against, can read the non-verbal behaviors that Amodio and Divine talk about, the uncomfortable interactions, the less eye contact, and all that, these non-verbal behaviors, and know that you are expressing a bias. So the mirror neuron in the target person can read your discomfort. It literally means that. And which is why it is very important to be aware of your implicit biases specifically and acknowledge them so that you can work on them, because the client you're working with will pick on these biases very easily because of the mirror neurons. Now, let me quickly go over how do we acquire biases, because that's important. We acquire these biases during infancy and childhood. Since most of our learning is pre-verbal and indirect at that time, we really don't have these filters, to stop the incoming information. And at that time, we absorb a lot of these biases from our environment. So the elements that make up these biases are both innate, which is the genetic predisposition, as well as learned. And it is learned in the sense that the child constructs these biases from their experiences. And since a lot of it is pre-verbal and it is taught indirectly, it's really not in your hands as a child to understand that what kind of biases you're absorbing at that time. It's only when you become an adult and you reflect, then you see that, okay, these are the biases that I have. So this is important to know so that you can remove that feeling of shame that comes with having a bias, because it's very, very normal and natural to be biased. And that's why I wanted to speak about how we acquire these biases and how they are innate as well as they are learned, and you are biased as a result of being born. But the important factor is that once you become aware of these biases, you can work on them. So how do we work on these biases? Now, here's what I want you to do. I would like you to think about a session that you had probably a week back, or anything that's really fresh in your memory, and think about a client that you met or you spoke to, and you had some discomfort, some kind of a bias probably that was causing this discomfort, and you didn't know what it was about. And I have these series of questions that can really help you to uncover these biases. So let's say during the first meeting, when you spoke to the client for the first time, what was your initial impression based on the client's cultural, religious, or spiritual background, or just by the way the client was dressed, or the way the client looked, or because of the client's race, ethnicity, communication patterns, language, anything? And did any of that at some level give you some kind of discomfort, even a little bit of discomfort? So I would like you to think about that. The next question that you can ask yourself is, during the sessions, once you started working with the client, were you able to identify certain hidden biases, or did certain irritations or certain resistance come up from your end where you felt that you cannot continue to work with the client? Something was bothering you. And the third question is that these biases, did they in any way hinder the sessions? Did they hinder the progress? Now, just think about these questions. Also, once you have answers for these questions, you can write down these answers, and then you can think about, did any of these beliefs or biases change over a course of time? So you did these sessions with the client, and you felt that, okay, whatever you thought about that client was really not true, which means that some of your biases changed. They transformed. You got to know something different about the client, and your perception was different in the beginning, and your perception changed. You had a cognitive shift. All this is really going to help you to really understand what was happening in the session. And this is a self-reflection exercise, and this can really help you when you're handling sessions with clients who are from a diverse background. or even clients who are from your same culture and from the same background that you belong to, you can have certain perceptions, beliefs even about them. So this is also going to help you when you're doing the EFT sessions with them. Now, here's a simple protocol for biases that you can follow that I've developed, and that can be really helpful, in my opinion. I've done this personally, and it has really helped me. So the first thing is that think about a client and identify some biases, as we did in the previous exercise. Just think about it, and the first thing that you need to do is become aware of the bias. Is there an aversive bias? Is there an implicit bias that you're not conscious of? And when you do become aware of it, congratulate yourself. That's wonderful. Being aware, realizing that you have a bias is the first step towards, doing something about it. So congratulate yourself that you have become aware, and instead of feeling guilt and shame, be willing to be kind to yourself, because obviously the guilt and the shame will come up, that you will say that how come I have this bias? I mean, how could I? This is not me, and you might have guilt and shame that can come up. So at that time, it's very, very important to be compassionate to yourself. So the first thing is welcome the bias, and you can even tap on it by saying, I'm thanking my consciousness for bringing this into my awareness. I'm willing to be kind to myself while I acknowledge this bias. And tap on it, tap on the guilt and the shame. Be willing to be kind to yourself, acknowledge the guilt and the shame, and congratulate yourself that you have brought it into your awareness. Work on the guilt and shame. See how you can transform the guilt and the shame. And the best way to transform is to understand the importance that I am aware of the bias and I don't have to feel guilty or shamed about it, because being aware of the bias is going to really help me and my client in the sessions. Now, the next step is to examine the bias. So if you really want to change the bias, you can just examine it and see where it comes from. It could be from your parents, the school, the media. And again, when you're doing this, when you are in this process of introspection, try to be kind to yourself and don't get stuck in the whole critical thought loop. Now, the next one is to tap to transform. So tap on the bias to be more flexible and open about what your client thinks. So you can tap on phrases like, even though I do not agree with my client's worldview, it is okay. So you don't have to agree with someone to understand them. You can understand a person without agreeing with their worldview. You don't have to change your worldview in order to accept the other person's worldview. You may not agree with what the client believes in, but you can accept your client's worldview with kindness. And you can say something like, even though I don't support or agree with my client's views, I realize that I don't have to change my own views. I just have to accept his or her worldview. I just have to understand their worldview so that I can help them in the best way possible. So as Philippa Perry talks about in her book How to Stay Sane, she says, the key is to be aware of the patterns we fall into when summing people up, and to learn to hold our views lightly and be more open to finding out about the people in front of us. And I just love this, what she's written. Now the next thing is, you can swap sessions with someone. You can work with a practitioner, you can work on the bias and examine it in more detail, because it's always easier to work with someone and on something as subjective as this. The next one is referral. If you still feel that your bias about the client is really hindering the sessions and it's really affecting your rapport with the client, then it's always good to refer the client to someone else. And that's absolutely okay. You just need to know your own limitations and the challenges that you're facing. And it's absolutely okay to refer the client to someone else, because remember when I was talking about the mirror neurons, and you know that your biases will be felt by the person in front of you, even if you don't express them overtly or show them in your behavior. Because of the mirror neurons, it can be felt by the person in front of you. Now, apart from EFT, there are certain other strategies that can help you to cope with your biases, transform your biases. and I'm going to be talking about that in the next presentation. I hope this presentation was helpful, informative, and if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comments section, and I would be really happy to answer the questions. And well, that's all for today, and have a great day.